My name is Jennifer Tegenye. Today is February 11, 2023, and I'm here with Feker Chain doing an interview. Wait, I'm sorry, that was wrong. My name is Jennifer Tegenye. Today is February 11, 2023, and I'm conducting an interview with Feker Chain as part of the Chicago Youth Movement's Oral History Project. So Feker, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today. May I have permission to record this interview?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so we could just start with you telling me about your childhood, where you were born and raised, and about your family.
Okay, so I am an Ethiopian immigrant, but I was born in Kenya. My parents were refugees from Ethiopia to Kenya, and then I immigrated to the States when I was a baby. So I grew up in Chicago, lived here. I'm the oldest daughter in my immigrant household. I have three younger siblings, but two older half siblings. I think that kind of pushed a lot of the dynamics in my household, and like kind of pushed me towards the movement that I'm in now.
Awesome. So you mentioned growing up in Chicago. Could you describe like what neighborhood you're in and like what that experience was like in your early years?
So I have always lived in Uptown, which is a primarily Asian neighborhood, but there is a large Black community. I think just like being in a community where there's so much diversity in thought and values, and like also having so many people who are in the same culture as me kind of defined a lot of this way that I think, and like just being around. I think also my friend group is also predominantly Asian. So I think being in those spaces has definitely helped me a lot when it comes to like my organizing work. I've also started a lot of my community organizing in Uptown. I think that was my first experience in with organizing in 2020. And I think especially with everything that's been going on in Chicago, I think a large part of it was what I learned here in Uptown.
Awesome. So did you go to school in Uptown as well? And like if so, what schools were they? If not, like what was your educational experience up until high school in the city?
So yeah, I did go to school here in Uptown for a few years from kindergarten, second grade. It was a predominantly Black school called St. Thomas of Canterbury. But then I transitioned into Sacred Heart Schools, which is a predominantly white school, and that transition was huge for me. I think, especially like growing up in a space where like a lot of people look like you, I grew up like not questioning that I was Black or Ethiopian because I was surrounded with people who look like me, and like we connected on a lot of the same values. But when I went to Sacred Heart, which is northern from the school that I went to, a lot of people didn't like recognize the things I was saying or the food I was eating, or just the values that I grew up with. So it was a lot different, and I felt like I saw myself kind of push a lot of those values down as a young person, because obviously I was in third grade, fourth grade, I wanted to be part of those places. But I think now like I'm at Northside, which is kind of more diverse, but we still have some problems there with diversity, where there's only 7 out of 260 people who are Black. But I think a lot of that transitions has helped me to like understand the importance of like representing culture.
Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned different times how you got involved with organizing being related to your relationship with in Uptown. Could you just like give me a rundown of how you did get involved in community organizing and what like your initial perceptions of activist spaces were in the early years?
So I learned about this program called Kinetic Organizers actually through you, but they came to our school at Northside. I think the summer before my freshman year is where I went to this small internship, and we learned a little bit more about it, but I wasn't that committed. I was, just focusing on going to high school. But the more I got involved, especially with COVID and being at home and like seeing all those racial changes, especially in my city, I think that's when I took it really seriously. And then through that time and like growing up in Uptown and just seeing people who look like me on the news, I think a lot of it like pushed me towards organizing, and like Uptown is a huge part of that because of that community space in Kinetic. But just continuing off of that, a lot of the work that we've learned there, and just like having meetings in person now, which is at the Kinetic space, which is like 5 minutes from my house. I think a lot of this work that we've done has been community organizing in Uptown, which is where I live, which has been really formative in these years. So
Awesome. So could you describe to someone who's not familiar what Kinetic is? And then you mentioned an internship, summer internship that got you started there. Could you also describe what that is?
So Kinetic is a youth organizing group as part of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice organization. So it's basically where they bring minority students in CPS to work on problems or current events that are happening at the time and like work on movements or protests or policy pieces or, like just meetings in general to kind of like provide space for those students. And then based off that, the internship that I got involved in was the micro internship for Kinetic Youth Group, which they just brought a bunch of CPS kids into a Zoom space. And we just talked about different ways that we wanted to see change in our system. And it was a kind of like an introductory space to like let people know like what Kinetic is. And then based off that, you could like apply for the bigger internship, or you could just work through Chris, which was our youth organizer at the time, to like work on a little initiatives if you weren't committed to the huge internships, but it was a great space to like get introductory to the space.
Awesome. So could you tell me about your initial perceptions of this space, like how you felt in it and if that changed over time?
Yeah, I think for me, organizing and activism, like before I got into this space, were kind of like just the big people that I saw on the news kind of going against the government officials. It was kind of like a big space and like a big title to have. But I think the more I got into community organizing, I saw more of the behind the scenes work that is not always seen on TV or like even in person. I think a lot of that work is really important. And I realized that like, of course, like those big moves and like policy work and those protests are very important. But I think my perception has changed on what community organizing is because of such important work that I've seen and done myself behind the scenes. And like that's kind of changed, especially I started organizing when I was young. I started at 14, freshman year of high school. So I think just starting out young and like growing into these spaces has definitely moved a lot of my perceptions.
Thank you. Could you talk about some of that work, like specific examples of things that you guys would be doing or discussing, in that space that you described as like behind the scenes, right?
Okay, yeah. So basically, like a typical meeting, or like action that we did would be like we would come into the space, we would debrief. Usually start off talking about current events, that we saw happening. A lot of our students are in different public schools, so we talked about like different things that would happen at the schools. And if there's any huge things, we would jot that down on a like a shared doc, and then kind of the work of like understanding the root problem, contacting officials, emailing students, creating Google Forms, a lot of the work that like are kind of minimized sometimes. A lot of that work was really important because we wanted the input from the students who actually go to that school. I think that was really important. And like also going in person, like I go to Northside. So if there was something happening on Northside, I would be able to go talk to students at Northside about that current issue or talk to admin, which was sometimes difficult that people didn't really see, kind of trying to get them to sit down for a meeting or like talking to teachers who couldn't officially say anything. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of that work was pretty hard, but it was worth it when we did our final, like action or plan.
Yeah. Does a specific example come to mind when you think about an issue that came up in one of the schools of Kinetic members and what kind of actions you guys would think about doing?
I think the biggest one was our walkout, I think about a year ago.
Mhm.
It was for undocumented students to get easier pathways to citizenship, and there was a policy that senators were voting on, um, and it wasn't seeming like it was going to go our way. So students around Chicago and different CPS schools kind of got together on a Zoom meeting, and we decided that we wanted to do a walkout out of our schools.
Mhm.
So a lot of that work of like going on Zoom meetings, figuring out bus routes, figuring out who was going to speak, I think that was like a huge part of like understanding what organizing was. I think that was a shift for me. That was the biggest thing I've ever done. And also just even speaking at that event, I'm not a person to really speak at big events, and that was my first time even being at a protest, so that was huge.
Mm.
So yeah, that was an amazing piece of work that I really like look forward to like continuing. So
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
mhm.
Could you talk a bit about the movement, right, to get cops out of CPS, um, and which like you've been interacting with and have been involved with, just kind of describing what the mission and goal of that movement is and like what you think about that mission and goal.
Yeah, I think in the beginning of when I got involved with that, it was a huge like thing overall where everyone thought like we just didn't need a space where like students came to learn and a lot of people felt unsafe. I am privileged to go to a north side school, and understanding that privilege, that I don't have as much of an experience, like a bad experience with these cops and CPS, but I know students on the south side and west side that I've talked to have a much worse experience. And I think understanding that privilege and also using the power that we have on the north side to like kind of push that, because even as a Black woman myself in these type of schools, we don't feel safe when cops are around. You know, our white counterparts might, but understanding that's not the same experience for everyone, and understanding that like people walking around with guns when you don't know what's going to happen, and like when people feel the distrust with the community that's in our school, it makes students not want to be able to come to school. And the whole point of school is to be able to learn, grow connections, you know, grow in our formative years. And having a cop there was just not our answer. So a lot of the work that we did, and especially people feeling unsafe, that was a goal that we wanted to like fix. And then we did that work, and behind the scenes Zoom calls, a lot of it happened during COVID. And just hearing the students' experiences, especially there was a student on the north side, on the south side that we talked to, and just like how different, like a cop was like following her around, and like was like, it was just a lot of experiences that we saw. Like, just we didn't need those cops in the school, and we're students, we're kids, and we didn't need someone with guns following us around. So that was a big part of it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Could you tell me about some of the challenges that you feel like you guys faced within that movement, within that work, and just generally like what that experience was when interacting with like city officials or school officials that you're asking to remove these cops out of?
I think a lot of it was when I first started in this movement, a lot of it was during COVID. So obviously some of the struggles was just even being able to get a meeting. We couldn't get in person because of the pandemic.
Mm.
Um, but a lot of like a lot of the city officials didn't want to hear from students. They didn't really see us as someone like that they needed to talk to. We weren't like someone on the news that like could end their career or something. So like a lot of them didn't really care. Like if we did get in a meeting, we would get 15 minutes, or if we ended up being in a meeting, they would kind of like bypass our questions. There was a lot of like back and forth with that. And then also just like handling all of that mental energy and space that it took. I didn't really understand that it would take that much. Um, but I think a lot of the challenges came from internal and external sources, and a lot of the external sources came from not taking us seriously.
So what are the examples of like people in authority that you think people in the movement had to negotiate with or had to talk to?
It was a range of people. We started with people in smaller positions like aldermen, all the way up until we got a senator on a Zoom meeting. I think it was kind of funny actually, because a lot of the aldermen are the people who didn't really care as much as the senators. The senators, I don't know how genuine it might have been, but they felt more genuine than the aldermen. I don't know what that's based on, but I think just in general, city officials didn't really take us seriously. It was kind of more of a front. Um, but it was kind of hard to like get these questions answered.
Okay. And what were the general dynamics within the organizing space among students?
I mean, at least in our group, and my experience was that it was more of a community. We obviously had our hierarchy for people who were there longer than us. But it felt like a community. I mean, we were all of our concerns and problems and projects were taken seriously. We talked a lot about our different experiences to kind of grow as a community. I mean, we had that shared baseline experience of COVID, and like also being minorities in Chicago. So I think that helped us a lot. And also being CPS students, we had a lot to connect on. So I think it was more of a family in a space where you could share, because we all understood that whatever was shared there would not be shared with others. So it was nice.
That's awesome. So could you tell me about the specific experience you had with your school? So like, are there still SROs in the space? And like, what was that experience like on that very local level?
We do not have SROs. They left, I believe, in the beginning of 2020, like before we came back from COVID. We didn't have any SROs in this building. I'm not sure if they were there while there was COVID. I'm not sure they would be, but once students came back in person, there was no SROs, which was a great thing for us. So
That's awesome. And I'm glad that you guys were able to get them voted out. Um, so I guess thinking more in terms of your takeaways from activism spaces, could you tell me some of the ways in which you think that your involvement impacted you and changed your politics, or like the biggest lessons you've had from engaging with this specific movement of getting cops out of CPS?
I think a lot of the times, like especially in the beginning of when I started participating in this type of work, was I didn't realize how much I could change, like even on an individual level. Um, like especially with this movement as big as Cops Out CPS, I think a lot of it had to do with students not being able to see their voices heard, or like even if they did have their voices heard, to see the actions come out of that. So I think a lot of the things I learned was that if you keep persisting, I know it's hard, and I didn't understand like the mental energy it would take, but understanding that there's people who will listen to you, and if you just keep shouting and like helping uplift those voices around you, I think that's really important to understand that like a lot of us have experiences where our voices were silenced, but I think moving towards change has a lot to do with speaking your mind and keep going. And like even if a lot of people say, you know, like your voice does not matter, you're too young or you're whatever, it's still your voice to be heard. So I think a lot of that has to do with continuing and persisting.
That's awesome. And then I guess like, did you feel like your activism changed your relationship to your neighborhood and like larger community members?
100%. I think I was never, I had my close friends and family in the neighborhood, but this has definitely changed my relationship with my neighborhood. Um, you know, it was just a place to live, and like I love my community, but this has really helped me to understand like I can change and like I can do the work that I want to see. And a lot of that had to do with just a small like steps towards change that I saw. And a lot of it had to do with just speaking with the neighborhoods that I got, neighbors that I've never spoken to before, like down the street, like random strangers, and like seeing their thoughts on it. Um, wow, it was just like a really formative part of like understanding like these are people, and like my community members deserve a voice, and I was happy to help bring them up. So
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
mhm.
So could you like describe your relationship with school during the time in which you're involved in activism? Um and how it might have impacted that relationship, right? Because you're doing activism of pushing school officials to get cops out of the schools and like things that interacted with CPS in a different way than other students.
Yeah, it was definitely hard. I think on a bigger level, like especially with admin, I saw that shift change of like if I saw my principal in the hallway, you know, it was kind of like I don't know, it was a different sort of vibe that I got, I think, towards like the beginning of the movement. And like whenever I would try to get meetings with admin, or if I was talking with the principal, it was kind of hard, and like it felt like I was seen as like sort of an outsider when it came to admin. The teachers were surprisingly more accepting, and like they understood, especially because a lot of teachers are minorities that I spoke to. Um, and it was a lot harder, especially like when you're seen as someone who's like trying to do something against the school. It's hard to like continue and trying to talk to them. But yeah, so yeah, it felt like I was kind of an outsider towards admin because a lot of the conversations revolved around cops out CPS, or like a lot of the movements that we're doing because of kinetic. But in terms of like students, you know, it was never a huge thing. A lot of students supported the activism, and they shared the posts that I was posting, or they were very supportive of that aspect. And a lot of the conversation, like if I was talking about a club with the principal, she kind of shifted it towards cop out CPS. So it's kind of like a lot of the conversation that I had, even if it wasn't about cops out CPS, or a lot of the movements that I was doing, it kind of shifted towards that. And it was kind of seen like I was a person of like, or like the people who were with me in Kinetic who are at Northside were kind of seen as a group of people who are kind of just that and not anything else. So it was kind of difficult navigating that.
That's interesting. Do you know of other experiences you think other students might have had in kinetic, but who went to other schools, and what that relationship might have looked like? Because earlier you mentioned that you feel like it's a different experience going to Northside versus some of the other schools.
Yeah, so there was a student who goes, I don't remember the school's name, but she does go to CPS school on the west side. And to my recollection, she was talking about how the dynamics in her school was that like when she would bring these policies or she would bring her projects towards her school, she was completely shut down. Especially since she's the only one who goes to her school who's in kinetic. She was kind of seen as a person who was trying to do too much, or she was doing things that were against people in her school. Like they don't get as much funding as Northside gets, unfortunately, because it's CPS elective enrollment school. And just like her experience of just talking, and like it was really sad to like see that like students around her weren't really supporting her because they thought that the change she was bringing was so different than what they've experienced before, and they didn't really like the way that was going. So I think her experience really like brought to light that like my experience was much like I had so much more privilege, and like doing the work to help her was important.
Yeah. How many other people in your school do kinetic? And what is that experience like having the community?
So last year there was about 4 or 5 of us, yeah. Now 3 of them have graduated, so it's just 2 of us left. But there are freshmen who have now started getting into that space. So there's 2 freshmen who go to my school who are now part of that space and kind of growing their organizing work there.
That's awesome. Do you think that the experience you had with administration in your school has changed over time? And is it better now, as kind of the movement has changed?
It's definitely gotten better. But I think especially like what I've seen at Northside, there's a lot more change to do. And I've expressed that I am pushing for more change. Like this is not the end all be all. But I think like our relationship with school has definitely gotten closer, but there's still a lot of like emails. Like if I send an email about a project that I want to do or like an initiative that I want to change, a lot of the emails are kind of like template emails that all students get, which has kind of been ingenuine and like kind of like demeaning to the work that I've been doing. But I think it's definitely gotten better over time.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And then on the flip side, can you describe kind of your relationship to and perception of the Chicago Police Department, and if that has changed throughout your involvement in this, if that has changed throughout your involvement in the movement?
It hasn't changed. I think in general, cops, at least from my experience and my identity in this country, it was never and never will be a necessity. And a lot of the things that they say that they're here for don't apply to me as a Black woman and as a student in Chicago. I think my personal beliefs are that they should be defunded and changed. I think that especially with everything that's been going on in the news and like just the stories that we've heard over and over again are a testament to the fact that their jobs right now are doing more harm than good, especially to people who look like me. So it hasn't changed, but just further my opinion of them. So
Mm. So you talked about the defund movement. Do you have experience working with anything that has to do with defund or like the people's budget? I know was a thing in Chicago.
yeah, so I was a one of the 46th ward representative of the people budget. So a lot of the work that we did was to divert funds from the police towards like the community or other aspects where the money could be of better use. And that work really helped me to see like the community members that I worked with also believed in the same thing. Unfortunately, there hasn't been much progress, but we continue trying. But I think if so many people are telling you that the work that the police are doing are not helping them or it's even harming them, I think it's an important thing to listen to.
Yeah. So what are examples of things that you were doing as part of the people's budget?
So we had actually Facebook Live with an alderman to talk to him about how he would vote on the budget for the Chicago annual budget. Um, and in those conversations, we talked about the values that he held and like what we wanted out of CPS. We emailed Lori Lightfoot, our mayor, and we talked about the different ways that we wanted the budget to change. We talked to community members to see their thoughts because a lot of the voices were not being uplifted, especially if they didn't have a huge like public standing. And just talking to his community members, especially in Uptown, because that's where I'm representative of. And we just talked a lot of like things that we wanted out of the budget, and we continue to do so.
Awesome. I'm grateful for you being part of that work.
Mm.
So I guess transitioning a bit and looking through all your years in high school, you're a senior now. What do you think you're most proud of from those years?
I just I'm proud of the growth. I think like even like this like even past all the big movements that I've done, cops at CPS, the undocumented student walkout, people's budget. I think the internal growth that I've had both on my values and just in general, the work that I thought I wouldn't be able to do as a freshman that I now do as a senior. I think that change has definitely been a big part. And like when I was younger, I thought I couldn't do anything because I was younger because that's what I was told. And I think my biggest accomplishment was like internally changing my mindset and like continuing to do that work that I'm proud of.
Awesome. What would you like to say to current and future Chicago youth like that are mobilizing their communities, especially for causes that you mentioned, right? Like educational equity or racial justice focused work that has to do with like education or the criminal justice system?
Do not let them stop you.
Mm,
Continue working, even if you need to take a break from all the work because of how much energy that it takes. Take your break, take your mental break, take care of yourself, but understand that the work you're doing is important, even if it's not, even if it affects one person, that's one more person that did before. So
mm,
just continue working because the work you're doing is amazing. You're amazing. And the fact that you're like pushing yourself to change things beyond yourself is amazing. So continue doing it.
that's awesome. Did you personally take a break during the experience with the movement?
I didn't really take a break. I just made sure I took time to myself. Like every day wasn't a work day for me. But I know a lot of the things took a lot of toll on like my other kinetic org members. So I
Mm,
know that they need to take a break and 100% take care of yourself because you can't take care of your you can't uplift other communities without first taking care of yourself. So I know that has a lot to do with self-care and just, whatever you need to do, do it, but understand the work you're doing is important.
that's awesome. So, kind of looking at your current circumstances at Northside, number one, like, how do you feel like your experience in that movement is impacting like your near future, right? You're like going on to college. What are some of the things that you're taking away from that work moving forward?
I think understanding the balance of like I know like a lot of the institutions like I've personally have never been to a college in person, but like the stories that I've heard, I know that a lot of the institutions may not care about you individually. And I think that's really reflective of like when you go out into this world, not everything is going to be for you. And I think the things that I've learned in community organizing is learning to advocate for myself, in a space where like I matter, my voice matters, and continuing to fight for myself. And I think when I go off to college, I will definitely take that with me and
Mm,
continue my organizing work there and uplift the people who are in my community there. Understand that everyone deserves to have their voices uplifted.
that's beautiful. And then just the last thing, currently in Northside, you mentioned that you guys do not have SROs. Um, has that kind of radically changed this space, or do you feel like there's still similar policing and surveillance of students within the space?
I think it's definitely helped. I mean, we do have security guards who are predominantly white. And that definitely has similar effect, but not as much, I would say.
Mm,
They do have surveillance cameras. But again, I have no problem with that. I think it's more of how they use it. Um, but I think it's definitely gotten better. But I think the way they treat students, especially at schools where it's predominantly not of that race, needs to continue to change because my experience as a Black woman there, at one of 7 students who are Black, has definitely changed, especially like people expecting me to like be representative of entire race and all that. I think that definitely has to change because everyone has their different opinions.
yeah. Could you speak about an experience where you feel like people of your racial or gender identity are kind of um still struggle with the same things given the current changes even?
Sorry, repeat your question.
So could you give me, so you said that currently, although it's gotten better, there's still problems, especially with you being one of like 7 Black students in your year,
Mhm.
and that you have predominantly white security guards. Like, could you give me an example of any interactions that you can think of that show you that things still haven't changed in the way that you want them to?
I think like even this might be minuscule, but just even 2 weeks ago, one of my friends, she's a Black woman, she had gotten food from during her lunch, and our security guard thought it was right to take it from her, because we weren't allowed to have outside food come into the building, which is a policy that we do have, but a lot of students have done that and like they get a pass. And we had to bring in our vice principal to come and talk to him to get her food back. And I just think a lot of the ways that students are treated in the school, however minuscule, like even over food, we just see like, even though things have changed, it hasn't changed that much, and we still have a lot of work to do.
All right, thank you. And then one last thing.
Mhm.
Can you describe, is there, so you mentioned there are surveillance cameras, but that you're kind of okay with that. Do you guys have like metal detectors, or like what are other structures within the space that security guards kind of oversee?
Yeah, so there was actually an experience. They do have um security checks. So as you come into the building, they randomly select students. I'm not sure how random it is, because they do be like from what I've seen, they've definitely taken more Black students than they have other students, even though like the logistics don't work of that because there's less Black students in our school, which doesn't really make sense to me. But it's kind of like they go through their bags, security check is a security check, but the way they're going about it is definitely something that is questioning to me. Like, it's just like a lot of the work that we've done is important, but I think change still needs to continue to be changed because things like this, however minuscule, continue to happen.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you'd like to add?
Mm, I don't think so.
Awesome. Well, I'm just going to ask a few demographic questions.
Okay.
So what racial and or ethnic identities would you identify with?
You want me to list all of them?
Sure.
I am an Ethiopian immigrant. I am a Black woman, cisgendered woman. Um, yeah,
Okay. So you covered the gender identity as well. Were you eligible for free and reduced lunch programs growing up?
yes, ma'am.
What level of education did your parents complete?
High school.
Okay. And then what kinds of responsibilities did you have after school, or do you still have after school?
Oh my goodness, too many, too many. I'm president of 3 clubs. I'm an older sister, like I mentioned before, so I have 3 younger siblings. Have a lot to do with them. I obviously do kinetic organizing. I am a basketball coach. I worked at U Chicago that ended a few months ago. Um, well, SVC, which is the Student Voice Committee at school. Um, yeah, I think so that's it.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was great talking to you.
Problem.